immigration, because finally we're seeing some policy work emerge from the coalition in an area where voters on the left and the right align, but where for too long politicians on all sides of the fence appear to have been in some sort of secret pact to do nothing. In part, I suspect, because the Labor left think everyone who wants to come to Australia should be able to, and in part because the Liberal right is worried about the state of the books. And they know that cutting immigration will mean the budget takes a hit because big migrant flows artificially inflate demand. But mugged by reality as home ownership becomes more and more unattainable for young people, hospital queues get longer, wages stay low, and culturally we see the fraying of our nation's social fabric, the coalition has started finally to wake up. Or should I say here, the Liberals have, because the Nationals have long been wanting a proper debate about population. But as we've seen lately, be it The Voice, Net Zero or immigration, it's the Liberals that have been unsure of where they stand. For whatever reason, at the last election, they failed to say and do enough on immigration. And clearly now they understand this is why they went backwards in May and why, in part, they're leaking votes to One Nation. I will never understand why, after giving Andrew Hastie the job as Shadow Immigration Minister, Susan Lee clipped his wings and sent out that charter letter a few months ago, making it clear that even though immigration was part of his role, he was not to have any say in the party's future policy direction on the issue. Now, hardly surprised that he then resigned, given that Hastie has led the charge post-election in demanding the Liberal Party does more in this area. Well, finally, it seems they're listening to him, because Hastie is right. In parts of Sydney and Melbourne, Australians can feel like strangers in their own country. And that's because under the doctrine of multiculturalism, officialdom has encouraged people to live in Hotel Australia, not join Team Australia. Since the Whitlam era, multiculturalism has largely replaced the official insistence on integration and assimilation that made post-war migration such a success. And this is an area where the opposition, it would appear, is flagging change. Well, hallelujah. Key aspects to their policy, we are told, will include deporting visa overstayers, massively scaling back the hundreds of occupations supposedly in short supply, seriously cutting back overseas student numbers, making it harder to appeal visa rejections, and this one's really important, stronger vetting and stronger Australian values provisions in visa and citizenship tests. Liberal sources have cited members of the Chinese Communist Party as being potentially barred from entry to Australia under their plan, because they say membership is at odds with the Australian values statement that all visa applicants must now sign. Values such as freedom of speech, freedom of association, and support for parliamentary democracy. Of course, these values, our values, are inconsistent with Chinese communism. But that's not the only ideology inconsistent with our values, is it? Let's be candid. How many of the Islamist types preaching their hate in Sydney and Melbourne mosques believe Australian values trump those of Muhammad? How many of the recent migrants who've participated in all the Jew-hating protests that have disfigured our cities over the past 2 years really respect all fellow Australians? Now, this was something we took for granted. Not anymore. So the coalition is on the right track here in wanting to make our immigration values test much more rigorous. After all, just because someone might come here, even for a short stay visit, does not give them any right to do so. It's up to us who we let in. As John Howard famously said, we decide who comes to this country and the circumstances under which they come. We decide that. Now, I've seen the reports today the United States is considering a requirement that officials be given access to somebody's social media history if they apply for a visa. And I've watched all the outrage here in Australia about it too today. Well, this might surprise you. I applied this week for a US entry permit for an ESTA, they call it. And they asked me already about my social media. Now, sure, it was optional at this time, but I put my Instagram details into the online form and I got back approval to travel in under 30 minutes. Now, did I mind doing that? Well, I didn't like it, but I accept a country has the right to ask you to comply with their rules if you want to visit. Don't like it? Well, then don't go there. I can't say I want us to put rules on the people who come to Australia and then rail against Americans doing the same to me if I want to visit them. And these are sentiments shared today by Liberal Senator James Patterson.
The US visa and immigration policy is a matter for the US government, and I would never seek to dictate to them the terms in which they decide how people enter their country, just as I would never accept any country, including our friends in the United States, dictating to us how we set our rules for our visas and immigrations. This is a sovereign matter. Every country is entitled to set the standards by which they admit guests to their country.
For 30 years now, new Australian citizens have been required to pledge allegiance to Australia and its people. And here's the critical line: whose democratic beliefs I share, whose rights and liberties I respect, and whose laws I will uphold and obey. But it's not just enough for newcomers to say that, they've got to mean it. Then there's a citizenship test introduced by the Howard government that has 5 simple questions about Australian values. Here's just one of the sample questions. It says, on Anzac Day, we remember all Australians who fought and died in wars, the creation of an independent Australian nation, or the arrival of the first fleet from Great Britain. Now, it's not exactly hard, is it? Yet some 35%, so 1/3 of all applicants apparently fail that test. So if the Liberals are really thinking of a tough new policy in the immigration space, policy that not only addresses the quantum, so the numbers of people coming to this country, but also the quality of the migrant too, well, good on them. This is the surest sign yet that, along with dumping net zero, that finally the Liberal Party is starting to return to the fundamentals of who they are, what they stand for, and who they are elected to represent. But put Andrew Hastie back in the immigration job, and then I'll know the Liberals are really serious.